Uh, yeah, thank you, Rupali, for introducing us. And the first panel is called Research Otherwise from the Academy. And our participant speakers embody this research otherwise approach. They come from institutions that foreground environment, social science, and collaborative design, and their work collectively moves away from top-down techno-rational solutions. Uh, they engage directly with the lived experiences of citizens and practices and the contested natures of urban space, and also examine the fundamental relationships between human and more than human habitation and the environment. So in this panel, we have Soumini Raja, Rupali Gupte, and Ratila Kundu. I'll take like 2 minutes to just introduce everyone and the larger questions that this panel can essentially open up. So Soumini Raja is an artist, architect, and academic whose practice moves fluidly between pedagogy, performance, and art. She is a professor and the head of department at Avni Institute of Design in Kerala and the chairperson of the Board of Studies in Design at the University of Calicut. With more than a decade of academic experience, her work frames design as a continuous negotiation between society, human and non-human, culture and the environment. She co-founded Studio Commune in 2016 and Atelier SR25 in 2025 as platforms to expand her research and art practices. She works at the intersection of feminist spatial practice, ecologies of adaptation, and post-human speciality. Then we have Rupali Gupte, who is an architect, artist, and urbanist based in Mumbai. She is the co-founder and director and professor at the School of Environment and Architecture and a partner at Bard Studio. She has recently been a senior research fellow at the University of Brighton. Her work involves extensive research on contemporary South Asian architecture and urbanism with the focus on housing and urban form, tactical spatial practices, and the role of gender in shaping habitation. Her work often crosses disciplinary boundaries and takes different forms: writings, drawings, mixed media works, installations, curations, conversations, walks, and spatial interventions. Her works have been shown nationally and internationally in biennales, including the 56th Venice Art Biennale, Sao Paulo Biennale of Art and Architecture, the Seoul Biennale of Art and Architecture, Dhaka Art Summit, and galleries and museums such as MACBA, Barcelona Mat Museum, Lisbon, Mumbai Art Room, Devi Art Foundation, the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art, Delhi, Project 88, IFB, and NCPA. She's been involved in designing the 11th Shanghai Biennale and in curating a national exhibition in contemporary architecture at the JKG in Jaipur, India. Currently, she's working on several retrofit projects in Mumbai. Then we have Ratila Kundu, who's trained as an urban planner with a background in sociology. She teaches at the Center for Urban Policy and Governance, School of Habitat Studies, TIS. She has a deep interest in studying marginalized and vulnerable social groups in our cities, the ways which they are excluded in the top-down urban planning processes and how they stake their claims to urban space in the face of rapid and neoliberal urban transformations. Her research, advocacy, and writing is informed by her continuous engagement with grassroots groups and collectives such as the National Hawkers Federation and Homeless Collective. She is also currently serving on the editorial board for the Review of Urban Affairs, Economic and Political Weekly. This panel will essentially open up how academic centers transform research from a descriptive exercise into a generative force for collective futures. And how can the rigor of scholarly inquiry offer models for a truly civic and ecological spatial practice? I invite each participant to reflect on their practice and speak through their works for essentially 10 to 15 minutes. And then we will open it up through a discussion with it. So I'll invite Soumini to come first.
Thank you, Vastu, for the generous introduction, and hello, everyone. Firstly, thank you very much, Rupali Prasad, for inviting me for this workshop, and also to SAT team. Thank you so much for this opportunity. To be very frank, I wasn't very sure what exactly is expected from this presentation, so I've just put together 3 strands of thoughts or the areas that I'm working with. If I'm exceeding time, please stop me in between. So I'll just share my screen. Yeah. So I grew up in Kerala, and often as a child I would visit my maternal home, which used to be a small village in Trivandrum. And this is my mom. This was taken very recently, but this particular space behind our maternal home, which was a Yakshi Kava. Kava is like a grove, and Yakshi is the divine spirit who inhabits that space. This used to be this place where I used to hang out as a little child. And after a very long time, I realized that it is probably the presence of, I don't know whether the spirit herself was present there, but it was a presence of so many non-human entities, from a small little lizard to probably the trees and the wind itself, that would probably encourage me to think in a different way later on in my life. But at the same time, we lived in Kochi, which, as many of you know, that it's a small city which was built similar to the way Mumbai was built, reclaimed over and over again, or we claimed from the water and other beings that once inhabited this space. So these two sort of geographies, in some way or the other, I feel have influenced the way I think about space. And therefore, and then later from Kochi to Trivandrum to now residing in Kozhikode, and for some time living in Ahmedabad, the idea of practice for me has been shaped by the cultural geographies, and especially these 3 urban centers. Kochi is not the old Kochi that I grew up in. Binali did a lot of change for Kochi, but Trivandrum and Calicut now in the last 5 years has sort of shaped the way I think about my practice. And here when I say practice, often I think yesterday we had this discussion with Sahil where he asked, do you practice? And it's very difficult for me to say yes I do or no I don't, because for me practice is an entanglement and it's not just about making of the buildings. So I want to take you through 3 kinds of work that I've done in the recent past, from these 3 specific cases of Trivandrum, Calicut and Kochi, and then maybe open up to discuss with all of you, think with all of you. So the one project that we started off at Avni Institute of Design was this idea of archiving Malabar's heritage. And I think once when someone came in and they said, we want to go see Kalai, that's the first time I was introduced to this place called Kalai. And for the longest time, Kerala, as any other Malayali, we have lived at the intersection of water and land, and we adapt over a period of time. And these adaptations are either on the land or in water or in these liminal spaces that we find it very difficult to describe as land or water. It is in one such visit to this, this edge of the river Mambura, and also this edge towards Kanoli Canal, which is a British engineered canal, that I encountered these very, very interesting buildings. I call it buildings, which to me is heritage of the population, the people there. It is also a historical representation of the trade and everyday architecture of the people, and it is also a site of their labor, because this is where most of the wood that came from Nilambur, which was a plantation which was established by the British. Teak was extracted, brought in through the river of Mambura. You can see the Mambura river there. And it came through the river, it was cut into pieces, and to an extent the legends say that the same wood, you can find it in Kaaba, in Makkah. So it had that kind of significance because of the trade route that we shared. And this entire stretch was lined with more than 200 such mills. And these are very different mills because they are timber mills. And today you can find these timber mills across Kerala wherever you travel. And so when we decided to document this, one of the questions was, it's just a timber mill. Why do you document it? What is so great about it? It's just a normal structure. And I think that is one aspect that I want to sort of emphasize through my practice, that oftentimes we consider heritage as those which belong to certain sections of the society, but these spaces which are of sites of labor are not really considered as heritage of the people and the place. So I don't want to elaborate too much on the history of this place, but what has happened over a period of time, or probably a century, is that with changing environmental laws, changing different kinds of trade routes emerged, and also the land ownership was land ownership status also changed, which led to a huge decline in these mills. So some of them still stand as ghosts of the past. They are not used, sometimes even abused to an extent. So this was one of the reasons why we started taking this up as part of our studio processes in the school. We did our RSPs here. We documented it not only in terms of its architecture, which the architecture students worked with, but we also did a documentation to understand what is this backyard today, what is that architecture of the backyard. And it was formerly a front yard, it was a phase of Kozhikode, it was a phase of the people, it is a history of the people, and how do we work with these backyards. So these are some of the images from some of the older structures, and this is how the interior looks like. And then, so instead of just looking at it as an object in space, we started identifying how this entire, the entire entanglement of this object with the people, with the place, with what has been happening over a period of time. And most importantly, if it's a backyard for us, whose front yard is it right now? And it was very interesting to sort of note that human beings engaged in several different kinds of activities here, which we documented over a period of time. But most importantly, what we encountered was this great ecology, the kind of birds, the kind of animals, the trees, all those mangroves that had once disappeared from the landscape had come back. And today it is a front yard of a very different kind of population, which we often not acknowledge in cities. Now this became the premise for us to engage with architecture and architectural discourse, where we asked ourselves, whom should we collaborate with, or how can we collaborate with the people whom we don't consider anymore as part of our landscape. So I'm just putting here two examples of two students who worked with me. Here architecture, as you all know, we are affiliated to a university and we're expected to make buildings and design buildings. But here it was a very open-ended kind of an approach where we said, you can even write manifestos. So that could be the product of your, 6th semester project. So this particular student, Mino Joseph, looked at this landscape, worked very intensely with the landscape and figured out that she wanted to collaborate with ficus, the banyan, which have now taken over a large set of these mills which are abandoned. And she started asking, what does growing architecture really mean? To an extent where she even said that, should architecture really be permanent at all? Can ficus grow over it and take over this entire building, which can be used for a very short period of time? And that itself can be a way of regenerating the space, and therefore it is not just us. So it's not about tectonics, but it is also about tropism. So from writing manifestos to designing, buildings, where this particular student of mine, Hiba, who looked at a collaboration between the people of that place and also with birds, because there have been several instances where in newspapers we read about, when we researched about it, we read about many birds are getting affected because of the polluted water that is coming out of Canoli Canal, because a lot of these hospitals and other industries are lined along Canoli Canal. So she wanted to do something for the birds, and through the birds sort of heal the people who are living there, who are broken and who are living there. So this was another way of approaching an architectural studio where her output was an architectural project, but it was in collaboration between the birds and the humans of this place. So the idea here that I'm trying to pitch is that when we talk about architecture, it need not be the object per se, but the program itself can reveal new forms of relationships and new kinds of entanglement that we have with the world around us, and therefore architectural language itself can be different from what we already know and what we already practice. And I think that is the role of an academy, where we don't produce architects for the industry, but we help students think whether to even build at all and for whom are we building this. This also takes to the next kind of project that we work in my studio, which is called Studio Commune, which I co-founded with my partner Vishnu. And we both have been fascinated with animals for a very long time, and wherever we go, we sort of click these pictures. This is from Ahmedabad, where I visited recently in Manek Chowk. You don't find cows now or camels now, it's largely goats. This is from yesterday's trip to Panjapol in Mumbai, and there was this tiny kitten who was sleeping there. This is from one of the visit 2 days back to Dharavi. This is from Banganga, which is again in Mumbai. And this is a very, it's a photo that I really love, which I took in Jan from Kolkata. And interestingly, in all these pictures, and any picture we take, we find animals, birds, trees, other vegetation that inhabit the spaces that we inhabit. But somehow our cities are often built for humans. Even when we design a street, for the aesthetics of it, we put a tree there, but we never think of these animals that inhabit these spaces, who are also rightful citizens of this place. So one of the areas that we worked with was with canine infrastructure. This was largely coming as a response to the issues related to human-canine conflicts in Kerala, and also that we were part of the rescue operations during 2018-19 floods. And oftentimes we see that there are a huge Kalayan population in pockets where food waste is dumped, or because of the mismanagement of our waste in the cities, it creates a kind of territory for the pack to have a kind of pack behavior. And often there are conflicts, and Government of Kerala at one point had almost asked the local bodies to kind of cull these poor inhabitants. So we started working with PFA, with many other NGOs, and we even co-founded an NGO called Hands for Paws. And we came up with this model where we took it to the local government asking if they could implement this. And it's an open thing. Anyone, anywhere in the world can try this out. So what we said was there are several lost derelict spaces which are in a state of disuse, which might be under the ownership of the local government in cities and its neighborhoods. Why don't we bring it to the forefront and start discussion on how to activate it, and what if that becomes a canine infrastructure, and the stakeholders could be the local neighborhood residents associations, there could be the PFA or any of these rescue teams that are involved in it. It could also invite from Kudumbashri network, who are largely the chechis who come to our houses to collect the waste. And also they run cafeterias. So what if we join these programs to create a space where we can feed the dogs, which are community dogs, we can bring our dogs, which are pet dogs, we can have a coffee there, we can even have a play space, we can have a small vet unit, so that if there is any kind of issues that we are facing, we can directly go there. Also a small pen like a space where the pups can be taken, because the more you look at them and you see them in these spaces, there's a possibility that you can you'll get them to be adopted. So it was a program which we tried to jointly work with PFA. We took it to the local government, but then that's when the COVID happened. So it's something that we're trying to implement wherever, whoever would like to take this model. So there is a constant engagement and a positive relationship that we are establishing with the citizens who are otherwise not recognized as citizens of this community. But one of the questions we got often was, who will sponsor this? Who will build this? And that's where we said we'll tap into the network of what we call as building organ donation process, which is just like how we donate our organs when we die to others who want to have a life. Why not tap into the architects' resources who have a lot of waste materials lying around? When you pull down a building, you don't have to throw everything away, but you can collect them. So we used to run a network called the Building Organ Donation, which is an online repository. It became an online repository because we lost our yard during COVID. So we would collect these and we will distribute these building materials to many others who might just require one WC or one wash basin, or for that matter, even what I showed before, this entire house was built out of these contributions by several people, and even those real tiny tiles that you keep as samples in your office. So we would go collect them from the architects and then put them together. So I don't want to get into the details of it. So this is one model that we thought we could tap into for constructing these kind of public infrastructure, which otherwise the government may not have a budget to even offer. With that, I want to come to the third part, which is a very recent work. I talked about, I'll just quickly show this. This is in Kochi. Kochi being a coastal city, this is a reality of about 10 kilometers away from Kochi city. This is one picture from an old movie where it shows how originally the people of some of these areas lived. You can look at the thatch roof, and these were on stilts. But over a period of time, our aspirations change, and some of these buildings that you see today in Kuttanad, and which is an NLP, and also in Ernakulam, the outskirts of Kochi have become something like this. But at the same time, we are also reeling under a very, very critical issue of tidal flooding. And so so this is Kochi, and you can see that entire network there. And you can see the Puttan Velikara, which I don't know if you can see it there. It's on the northern side. So we had visited this place, and this was put up as part of an exhibition called Kaboom, which is an art for coastal commons, where we were invited to respond to this condition. And some of us came together, myself with two of my students, we came together to respond to this. And we looked at what we call as salt and water, and how does salt and water sort of engage with all of us. What happens when water begins to drink us and when salt begins to corrode us. And this was the premise with which we worked. I'll just show you one example. I don't know if you can see this, and with that I'll end this presentation. This is photogrammetry. I don't know, can you see it online? No, right? Stop share. So, as I mentioned before, sometimes documenting heritage need not really mean these big colonial structures or otherwise, but it can even be documenting this heritage, because soon after we documented this, 2 houses, they collapsed. So this is a photogrammetric method through which the local houses were, a few of the local houses were documented, and this became the backdrop with which we sort of pulled some of these materials which we thought responded to water and salt in very uncertain, precarious ways. And we said, salt we eat, it bites into concrete. We build to keep water away, but it soaks through brick, steel, and paint. Everything that we claim as ours begin to question us back. What does it mean to possess? What it means to lose in a world that is always shifting and always slipping away? We are salt, we are water, we are in fact architecture, and architecture is us. And in that sense, we are in a strange entanglement.
Recording in progress. Recording in progress.
So this is the condition of the buildings that you see there. These are houses built by the poorest of the poor in Kerala, and every year they have to spend lots of money in simply keeping it as is, and they get into this debt trap. And this is the aspiration that we architects are putting across to the public, saying, forget your kacha houses, which are made of thatch and stilt and bamboo, which used to very beautifully adapt to the situation of flooding, because flooding is not new for us, but build like this, and then your lives will be safe. So we were trying to respond to this condition, and one second. Let it go. Yeah. And so it's continue to share, right? So this is just a very quick walk through that project that we did. So we sort of pulled out these materials. You can see those salt. We made brick out of salt, in fact. Did the pressing without any binder. We were discussing about the binder yesterday. So they were, and the idea was to make that entire area out of salt brick. But unfortunately, salt will not stand in the humidity. So there was salt everywhere, in fact, and yeah. Just simultaneously. Can you see it? No, right? It's breaking, I think. Yeah. So it was also to say that, as you rightly said, that oftentimes we go to a field and we are an outsider looking at the field, but it is only when we start walking the path that they have been walking and they walk, it is when you realize what is happening around you. So it was both something to be looked at, but it was also something that you walk through and experience. So I'll end it with that. Yeah, so I strongly feel that practicing architecture is not only about making buildings, it is about thinking and asking why to build at all. Thank you, I end it there.
Thanks, Somani. So I'll invite the next speaker, Rupali Gupte.
Thank you so much, Somani, for this lovely presentation. And just to say that this panel, the first panel, is also called Research Otherwise. And so in some ways, and this research otherwise is something that can, I think, only be located in an academy where you're also able to deflect some of the given ideas of what practice is. And when Somani also said, this question of where people question her whether you practice or not, or even when Vajanti sort of prefaced her talk by saying she's not an architect, I think it is really time to kind of claim the full spectrum of what practice is. And I think every single person over here in this room is a spatial practitioner, and I think that's something that we need to be able to also claim in our full capacities. And so what I'm going to present here is really the practice of the academy. We run the school. There's a group of colleagues that came together that started a school, but also our colleagues who are teaching here are part of the collective that is actually running the school. And we call this soft form, the form being also the form of the institution as a soft institution. And so I'll just do two things. One is locate this idea of what it means to run a school of architecture as a practice, as an institution, and which then has the capacity to scale up the idea of what multiple kinds of practices are. And then a next part, I'll sort of also show a bit of a studio project that then also became a research project and also became a practice from within the academy. So yeah, what does it mean to start and run a school of architecture in Mumbai? This is what we have to contend with. Very high, an institution requires very high resources, and you have to contend with all kinds of tough regulations, and that actually generates a standard institution. So how do you in some ways break away from that? The other thing is current market and social forces are extremely discouraging for small schools of architecture. There was the Supreme Court verdict that says there's no bar on architecture work for not from and other architects who are not, and people who are not qualified as architects. And so in some ways architects lose their jobs. But it also opens up a space of really kind of then creating a new kind of practice, which is not that kind of extractive practice that is otherwise centered around. And this is something that is extremely important. Architectural practice currently, the practice itself, but also what we teach only caters to 5% of the architectural population, of the population. So what does it mean then to extend that? And then how do we train architects? And this, again, central question, spatial injustice remains at the core of Indian architecture. So, here we are seeing the SRA buildings, that's a sale building there, completely legal, but with no light, no ventilation, and no spaces to really kind of perform one's life in a social and economic space. And these are really the institutional problems that we have faced today from the academy, and these are concrete problems. And all of us who are actually running institutions or are part of institutions know this, that academia is now reduced to education providing. So you're kind of it's a transactional space of providing education. Teachers are not considered intellectuals, they become logistical providers. Financially and culturally, it's expensive for students as well to engage with this. There is no real comprehensive review framework that exists. Institutions are seen as competitive spaces that are really not required to talk to each other. You need to compete with each other to get students, to produce work and show your work off. And institutional agendas are limited to completing university syllabi, and that's something we have several conversations with. And so the pedagogic problems are that there is an absence of a relevant humanities course, a relevant course on spatial theory, research methods. They don't exist in the architectural curriculum at all. All cultural, economic, and environmental problems are seen technologically. So there's a kind of technological framework to that. Professional courses are about logistics and not ethics. So in fact, in the charter, in professional ethics courses, it is really about how to help the client not be thugged by the contractor. But ethics is really about being, locating oneself in society. So in the School of Environment Architecture, we've sort of expanded the course, professional ethics course. Students are not trained to engage with 90% of the population, as we've said, and a singular type of professional practice is imagined. The entire architecture course is then geared towards that 10%. And of course, clientele based through education is through instructions, through submissions, through examinations. So that's sort of summing up this slide here. And so then how have we set ourselves up here as a practice in the academy? The first, as an ecosystem of education, creating a research platform, city and worldwide engagement, community support, and constantly mutating this kind of space, providing space for multiple practices, and basing the education on this. So in some ways, again, taking away from the coaching class model of education to create this kind of ecosystem where students, teachers are practitioners in this ecosystem. Pedagogy as conversations and not instructions alone. Developing a critical culture based on drawing, making, and thinking. Creating new knowledge on space, place, and inhabitation. This is from a kind of space that we've created for ourselves called Center for Spatial Studies, where every practitioner, every faculty member is a practitioner and locates themselves in this. And a lot of the courses then come out from this new research that is produced within the academy. Building visceral understanding of space, technology, and culture. Focus on the southern world, on South Asia, and these are again primary studies that we do, go to places, collect archives, build archives, and engagement with communities and the world directly. So all kinds of public engagements that we have, we see the school as a cultural space in the city, inviting people to the school, but also going out to communities, doing projects within various communities. And again, I would say really one of the only places that teaches repair and retrofit, ethics along with logistics, spatial theory, specific to South Asia, and technology not as application but as experiments. I think that has been our intervention here. And so again, to sum up this slide here, And then, so what are the emerging questions? One of the emerging questions for us, and this is really, again, concrete space that we're located in, where a lot of the older people who are here in this room sort of started with being educated in a place in the early decades where the schools were state sponsored, there were fewer number of students. That sort of in the 90s shifts. We have now the main actors being builders and politicians. The number of schools sort of increases, and now where we are located in the post 2000s, it's exponentially increased. The actors are now private education trusts and also business houses, within which we are like a little blip that is located, group of architects that have started the school. And some of the schools here like Avni and Vadiyar and other, there are some certain schools of architecture that are those little blips in that. And again, the number of graduates who are coming out is also exponentially larger. So both a crisis for the profession of architecture, but also a potential to really kind of look at how do we then expand the idea of practice itself. And then again, where will resources come from for this growth is a big question, because growth is otherwise seen only as empire building. You know, you get more and more larger and larger campuses that are extractive in themselves, larger number of students. So how do we again be more agile and break away from that? How do we deal with those regulatory constraints? What about the question of scale? How do spatial practitioners become relevant in an era of cultural decadence? These are emerging questions that we are dealing with. And so how do we see ourselves in the future? And these are, again, why it's important to have gatherings like this, that we need to think strategically and act tactically about resources and regulations, thinking through the idea of non-asset based, networked, non-certificate based, ecosystem based on culture as a cultural space and not only as an educational space. Networks and collaborations as key for growth and validation, and which is why I urge this group here to not treat this as an event, as a one-day thing, but a kind of long durée engagement where we are also able to create a networked, agile space that is, you know, not resource intensive. And I would really kind of urge the SAT workshop to be also able to facilitate this in the future. Another important thing for us is to really think of the idea of open pedagogy. So while we're a small school, what does it mean to reach out to a larger world where we kind of look at open pedagogic structures, which are also an intervention in scale and culture. Again, setting up models and platforms for more practices to appropriate them. Everything that we do here is online as an archive. There's a course curriculum that is freely available to download for people to look at. There's a big study that we did on educational ecosystem of architecture in India that is also available, which has suggestions for what one can do for institutions in the future. Again, summing up slide here. But I'll just end with these two things. One is this. Again, this is an important statistic. What are architects doing? 49% of architectural projects are individual houses. And this is really where students will be. But then if it's 25,000 students graduating, they are not going to be able to build those individual houses. So what are new models of practice that one can build in the future? Validation machinery is almost a joke. You'll see awards that are given for kitchen design project of the year or washroom design project of the year. These are our validation machineries. And again, really deeply problematic. This is really the bulk of education is by state-led private universities are taking the burden of education. This is the geography of where architecture schools are located. So you will see that the north, the center and the northeast are actually completely missing from the field. And I've said this before, humanities becomes almost negligent in architectural education curriculums. But even when it exists, you'll find in the syllabus, and this came out of the study on architectural education that we did, looking at 406 schools of architecture. And what you actually see under humanities is Greek and Roman architecture. So again, abysmal. So, and then what are the kind of research practices that are happening through the academy? And again, if you see that it's mostly technological, really not located in the contemporary relevance of societies. Again, this is how we teach in a linear way. Space making, where you have a client, you require a clear program, then you do detailed surveys, working drawings, and then you kind of hand over. It's a linear process. But space making does not happen like that. It happens more in India. For that 90% is more rhizomatic. Whenever you need a space, you expand, you do, So it's not linear. And so then how do we teach that, right? So this leads me to, again, a kind of intervention in then teaching, where you're not teaching a full semester, but modular teaching, where we teach in modules. I'm going to skip this because I want to come to the last bits, because I'm seeing Prasad pointing out. But again, really kind of building a new kind of curriculum for these kind of questions. So questions of new forms of space, questions of experience, questions of material studies, questions of the environment. All these are part of the course curriculum. Ontological questions of space. So instead of saying you build a school, we say the students ask what is a school, right? So, and just to kind of end with these two projects that the fourth year students, some of them are here as a practice again, where students were working with the questions of mass housing, which is embedded in the university curriculum. So in this case, they worked with the concrete projects with cooperative housing societies in Mumbai, and then they went through a very concrete feasibility study that looked at, how does the economics of this place work, and then they came up with 3 models. One was of using the entire economic potential, but all the way to repair and retrofit of the existing models, and then I'll just skip these. So they did these projects, worked with the community to look at how to actually engage with these, and several kinds of ways in which they looked at how they could deal with the current housing projects. They presented these to the community that actually came to the school. And then this one was a project, again, some of the students are here, where they worked with repair and retrofit of a settlement study. This is something that happened over 2 years. Current settlement, the Takkar Bappa colony, where they said, okay, you don't need to build everything. It's impossible, because given the current policies, there are no developers who are coming here to build, and if that is the case, then how do you work with you improve habitation? So they presented these projects to the community, and then some of us are then extending, people carrying models back home, and then some of us in the school are also working with the community, extending the studio projects to then say, how do you actually work with improving some of these houses? So it's a kind of, again, I'm ending with this slide here that sort of talks about this idea of a practice that comes from the academy, a practice that is then asking relevant questions, which you cannot ask, because if you're outside it, you're located in a conventional practice, the logistics of that practice take over. And so what are the new questions that one can ask from the academy and locate oneself in a practice that is then connected to a relevant question of space? So thank you so much for that.
Thanks, Rupali. I'll invite the last speaker for this panel, Ratula Kundu. Yeah.
Um, Good morning, everyone. and, thank you, everyone, Rupali, Prasad, SAT team for inviting me. And as part of this really, let's say, setting the stage panel about talking about research, about practice, about space, how do we make space, how do we think about space, how do we develop space, how do we think about what is our role in this entire thing. So caveat again, like Vajanti, not an architect, more of a sociologist come urban planner. And I'm going to be speaking about more from the collective that I belong to, which is the Center for Urban Policy and Governance, which is based at the Tata Institute of Social Science in Mumbai. And this center came up in 2008, roughly, and since then, we've been running two master's programs. One is the Masters in Urban Policy and Governance. The second one is the Masters in Urban Development, Global Urban Development, which is a dual degree with Sciences Po in Paris. And it's an international kind of collaboration with Sciences Po. I think the reason for the center is not to just impart knowledge through our programs, our master's programs, but to also build knowledge, produce knowledge, specifically about cities, specifically about the urban processes, about urbanization, but how to do this in a manner that is situated in the complicated, complex nature of cities of the global south. And really to sort of think about our position as not as specifically architects, those who deal with space, material space, but also think about space, making space, building space. And not also in the urban studies direction. So somewhere in the middle is where we stand. We're looking at urban policy, urban governance, looking at really the intersection between the stakeholders that are very important in actually intervening in space and making space in particular ways and responding to that and in addressing some of those challenges. Who are these stakeholders? So this is the market. This is the government that thinks about the cities, right? Coming up with policies. And of course, in doing so, I think what we're doing is responding to structural violence that we see today in cities. And by this I mean the quiet ways in which the cities and the urban is being restructured in ways that fit a particular kind of aesthetics. It's a rule by aesthetics, as Gardner would say, a particular form, a particular built form that's coming up, a particular kind of investment, a particular kind of profit-driven motive in the way in which cities are being reorganized. And in doing so, what we're seeing is that it leaves out, it excludes, it marginalizes, it dispossesses, it displaces particular groups of citizens, particular groups of inhabitants. It excludes questions of ecology, of non-humans. And I think in that sense, a lot of it is to do with the spatial injustice that you were talking about. So building knowledge, how do we build knowledge? So critically, what we do at the center is to take up research projects or think about research in a way that's critical, but that's engaged with communities, bound, sort of embedded within communities, to think about the ground up ways in which people actually constitute, people make cities. People are not just victims of these processes, but they keep challenging, resisting, forming their own habitats in their own ways. It's surprising that you said 49% of architects build individual houses. But the ways in which we work with, in urban informal settlements, that's 60% of the population in Mumbai. Who's the architect there? It's people themselves, some contractors perhaps at the local level, but I'm sure you guys are not going to work there, perhaps, or maybe. In some ways you would, and maybe that's going to be, questions you will take up. But who's really sort of thinking about spaces, about these places that are marginalized, disenfranchised, constantly peripheralized, actually physically removed from the heart of the city and thrown to the outskirts, in buildings where all kinds of planning norms have been diluted, where really questions of hygiene, light, sunlight, ventilation don't really matter much because you don't even treat them as people in the first place, right? They are an impediment to your city building project, right? So to respond to that, how do we build a research practice that takes along, that is ground up, people-based? How do we talk to them? How do we listen to them? What is the language? How do we design some of this? How is it non-extractive? Because social science academia is equally, if not more perhaps, extractive in the ways we have actually extracted knowledge from people we talk to, because it's like, we talk down to them. These are our objects of research. They're not really the subjects of your research. They're not thinking through with you. So to break down some of that, how do we actually reorient ourselves? So for me also, in the last 15 years that I've been with the center, it has been a huge learning experience with my colleagues, trying to think about this. And I'm going to give some specific examples of how we've done community-based, people-centric research about city making that can respond to some of these larger questions of structural violence. So this has been involved in a project which is called the M-Ward Transformation Project. Since 2011, M-Ward is the administrative location. It's on the eastern periphery of the city. One of the worst performing wards, administrative wards, when it comes to Human Development Index. And this being located right there as an educational institute with a very long history of social work, embeddedness, responding to, injustice, etc., thought that, this should be, like you said, foreground and background, right? This should become the foreground, not the background, not the dumping yard of the entire city, which it actually is treated as. So began this exercise. And this exercise, much like what you said about SAT, we were sitting there, right there in that ward, and we realized, maternal health was very poor, education was very poor, full of informal settlements, which had been pushed out of the city into this peripheral area, the dumping ground, etc. I mean, it's massive. I mean, there's a whole lot of spatial politics that has led to this kind of situation in the M ward. So I'm not going to go into that, but historically it has been produced in that manner. So how do you work in there, and how do we sort of build a research practice in there? So what we have is this M-Ward transformation project. We began with understanding what are these communities over there, what is their life, everyday life like? What are the parameters around health, education, what is their access to transportation, what is their access to other kinds of essential things. What is the actual space looking like, particularly sanitation, of course the housing structure, etc. All of these are extremely precarious built environments, the informal settlements themselves. And going with that, what happened is over time, the team in the MWAT project that works there, is embedded there, has built a set of social relationships with the community living there. So there are conveners from each of these smaller localities or neighborhoods within the larger administrative ward. And these conveners come together whenever there is a discussion around what project should we take up. The discussion is always about how, what are the strategic benefits for communities to be involved in these projects. And therefore then, is it a go for us or is it a no-go for us? How do we become involved in this? What do we set to gain from this? Because these are important questions to be asked, right? And the community should be debating and discussing this, right? So what have we gained out of this? So just as a concrete example, during the COVID pandemic, for instance, when the entire city was talking about stay at home, when the entire city was talking about centralized, large kind of centralized, isolation units, using the stadiums, or the housing on the peripheries, sort of to isolate patients. Within this extremely densely built informal settlements, we were saying, how would isolation look like in a really small house with no windows, no water source? How would you do this? So the community came together and they talked about which would be these collective spaces within the community to set up these kind of isolation spaces within the slum, right? So these could be within, say, a little bit of courtyard outside the temples, the mosques, the common spaces that they identified, fields in which livelihood practices could continue for street vendors without being forced away by the police, because livelihood was equally important for these people at that time. So what actually came about at that time is really looking at habitats from the lens of the poor people who were in these settlements at that time, to think differently about what could we reclaim as common spaces, public spaces. And that brings us to, I think, questioning, how are rehab housing units being built? Do they think about these kind of spaces for housing, or creating common spaces for, say, isolation, flexible spaces where, you could take care of health issues, especially given that some of these settlements suffer from TB, tuberculosis, because of the kind of environment that's been created, unfortunately, by absolutely, buildings that I don't know what kind of codes they're following. They probably, it's really inhuman the way in which some of these rehab buildings have been built. But how can we think differently? And the people themselves said, we can therefore think about spaces to have multiple uses. We should think about these spaces as having, larger public dimensions. So not just about the community, but as a whole. So you can't fit them within the household, but you can take them into a larger sort of area. We also saw these conveners coming up during the pandemic to come up with voluntary ways of dealing with hunger. And hunger was within the first or the second month, when people lost their livelihoods because they couldn't walk out of their slums for their daily work, we saw people coming up with community kitchens. And these were in the little spaces between houses, or that way they were trying to reclaim, people sort of donating their resources, materials, etc. But Kerala does have community kitchens, right? So you don't need to really reinvent certain models. It could be there already which you may need to institutionalize by thinking about space differently. And it is the people who actually showed us some of these ways to think about. At the same time, during the pandemic, we also started to develop a crowd-funded map with the help of many architects who have been working on the city, different layers, because we realized that there was no map that actually put down or which could be accessed by people, general people, to show where were the public hospitals, where were the public places where you could get medicines at a small, at a discounted rate, where would the public distribution systems be. So people had these maps in their heads, in their own hyper-local realities. But it wasn't pan-city. You didn't know. So a lot of aid distribution that was happening at that time was unfortunately overlapping. So there were charitable organizations coming together, civil society actors coming together, trying to distribute aid, the government trying to distribute aid, but you just didn't know where to go because there was no map showing, overlaying it with the slums, where are all these facilities, public facilities actually located. So we came up with this crowd-funded map, crowd sort of sourced map with these different layers, and it took off a life on its own actually, and my colleagues who developed it worked with a really, really large team, again, all voluntary work during that time. So MWAD transformation project, if you come to MWAD right now, there's another way in which space has been reclaimed. And I think one of the things that guides the work that we do at our center is also to think about how public space within the city has increasingly become privatized, right? Has increasingly been appropriated by different kinds of forces, especially market forces. To challenge this, how do we do this? So one of the things is located within the planning process itself. Unfortunately, we create reservations in our master plan, in our development plan, but due to lack of funds or political will, those spaces become defunct spaces, often taken over by antisocial elements. And so within MWAD, there was this space which was marked in the development plan as an open space. But really what it was, taken over by antisocial elements completely. It was a no-go zone for most women in this community. And what it then forced our team to do is really rethink with the community, what could this space become? Today, what you have in that space, thanks to the work of the community, the pressure that they put on the government at the local level and at the regional level, what you have in that space is a library. Is a library which has come up, which is sort of operated partly by TIS, but it's a lot of community effort as well. It's an open sort of space where the community youth can come, they can access computers, they can access the library books. It's a safe space for them to engage in multiple conversations, which was not possible. So 10 years, 15 years back, you would have seen the youth in Govandi, in parts of Devana, Shivaji Nagar, actually studying on the railway station steps. Because that is where the light was, that is where they had some space to actually concentrate, to do some actual work, studying, etc. But today you have the library which has reclaimed that open space that was taken over by garbage and elements that were using it in a different way, but is now very much embedded within the locality. And the community use it. So there's also a community gardening effort that has come up and greening effort that is also happening in that way. So MWAD is this experiment in progress. We're still figuring out ways to actually, how do we do this better? There are different projects, different streams in which we are working now with the mangroves which are there on the dumping ground, but I think questions of livelihood, questions of habitat, questions of ecology, questions of gender, sanitation, questions of identity are inextricably linked in the kind of work that we are doing there. at the moment, which makes it so much more difficult. And as of now, we're also developing an urban lab, which will embed also our students and will sort of facilitate them as part of the actors of this space. And so we create a continued sort of effort to sort of, through this lab, we hope to sort of create and build forward this practice, taking forward how do we get our students to think about policy not from top down, but from ground up, thinking about how lives are actually lived in practice on the ground. I'll now shift a little bit and talk about a little bit just about my work particularly. So in the city, I've been working with the Homeless Collective, and just because you showed those pictures, it's taking me back to some of the work that I did on the houseless in Mumbai. Again, during the pandemic time, which really brought about this question about, what is a home? Many of you are designing homes. What really stunned me was this, this thing about when we were there with the community, again facilitated by the Homeless Collective, which is a collective of social workers, activists working embedded within the community of the houseless in Mumbai. When we were sitting on the mat, on the pavement, there was a little boy who was playing with his pet, which was a dog, and there was a little girl with a bird in a cage. Then which the bird sort of came out. It was a chick. I think it came out and it was hopping on the mat that we were sitting in. And it completely, and there were our chappals, our shoes were kept outside, literally, And then I started to think, what is the outside? But in their minds, this was their home. This was very much their home. It wasn't the pavement, And that was a lesson to me, what do you call as a home? It wasn't a house. It was a home built of social relationships, built out of love, built out of family, familiar bonds, a place where you could rest, a place where you could, reproduce your social functions, etc. And that, I think, was, one of those prompts to really rethink how do you look at, space making, who makes the space. Linking this back to policy, it was surprising that all of those people that we spoke to who were dwellers on the pavements had voter IDs. And the address on their voter IDs was the pavement, the street number. So it wasn't a home, but it gave them particular rights to the city to access certain things in the city while also excluding them from other things in the city. And this is the question that they kept asking us and saying, don't call us Beghar. Beghar is a person without family, without relations. The city is our home. We have homes. The city is our home. Don't call us Beghar, because that's an insult to us. So I'll just leave it there.
Okay. Thanks, Ratula. Thanks, Rupali. Thanks, Somani, for sort of opening things up. We didn't necessarily have a sense of, it wasn't thought of as presentations and questions and comments, but maybe what we thought might be useful is to sort of, think about certain ideas, concepts about research and about academia, but also about art, about practice and architecture that sort of, emerge from the work of three of you. It's the COVID is sort of interesting because it's, brings up the question of the sort of the impossibility of living in isolation, where you really need to, extend yourself, to collaborate, to sort of reach out to someone else, to be able to survive in those times, right? And in some sense, all the three practices are, so one is the larger sort of the context that later, Rupali talks about the sort of the institutional landscape for architecture schools, also the architecture profession and what kind of practices and what kind of projects seem to be coming out of it, which Vaijayanti also spoke about. Ratula sort of speaks about the larger context of the city in which that there are the bigger questions of structural violence, displacement, questions of planning and governance, that sort of make the city both a place of violence, but also a place in which other kinds of practices are sort of emerging, right? And so many, given the context in which you work, really, it's a context of firstly climate change, but also where the presentation seemed like the spaces can't be thought without the question of this entangled life between different species, between salt in the water, and between birds and animals. Right? So these are the larger contexts in which all three of you are operating, but also trying to think about what kind of practices are possible in these contexts. Right? So one of it was to think about the academia itself, which seems to be moving away from the old model of, like Rupali said, teaching, but thinking about it as a collaboration, right? And the second is where the studio or the classroom is not necessarily thought of as a space for sort of this one-sided teaching, but it's also becoming a place for where the students and who's teaching is becoming a collaborator in producing a possible way of thinking about research, given that we all work in a landscape of where the funds are sort of limited. So it's sort of that sense of collaboration. So the academia seems to be shifting, so is the idea of what a studio is. Also in that sense, the community is, again, like Ratula pointed out, it's not someone you plan for, but it's sort of an extension or an extended idea of a community which keeps feeding back into what the academia is, but also how do we do a studio, because it becomes impossible to think about studio without that sense of the community. So that was one aspect of it. The second was, there's a range of spatial terms that seem to be changing, right? Questions of heritage, what is a site particularly, how do we think about sites? That none of you actually spoke about a site as a place for it, right? It's thought of as this field which has multiple actors, multiple stakeholders, multiple species. So the idea of the site, seems to be sort of dissolving or sort of moving away from it. Right? The third thing was to, think also about architectural practice from within an academia, right? But also sort of moving across these fields of, art interventions, architectural practices, research practices. So, all three of you moving. But it's also that the architectural practice is not the old model of, that there's a site and you build, but it also involves this process of gathering, right, resources, right? So for the gathering materials, for gathering material funds, institutions to sort of create a new milieu within the larger milieu in which you're operating. Similarly, C has been sort of instrumental in sort of producing meetings, interventions, gathering funds and resources, organizations to sort of extend itself into this network, but also so it's sort of, and this, has been, pioneering it from years, but I think there's a shift that is occurring where the, the community is really has conveners. So it's almost like there's a different set of governance system that seems to be set up, that seems to be feeding back into the practice. Right? And it's the third part of it is also what architecture means in that sense, which is not the building of projects, but there's a whole set of archiving and documenting that seems to be going on. Sort of creating spatial networks, right? Not necessarily just built form in that sense. And I think the mode of writing, or not the classic idea of writing, but this drawing and archiving and making, but also writing of different forms, performance. So that idea of what architecture writing is also seems to be shifting. Right? So, yes, I mean, those are the sort of larger things that seem to be emerging from the practice that is sort of gathered. I would, maybe to start thinking about it is, one is to where is it possible to start, which is already starting to change, but since we're sort of looking at these two ideas, one is this idea of research otherwise, particularly in relationship to spatial practices, both architecture and planning. The second is thinking about academia. The third is research practice itself. So I was wondering, to sort of open it up to think about what, the possibility of architectural research would be as a generative practice, not for the present, but in the sense of, for the future, because we're all sort of working independently of each other. But to think about a larger sense of, a gathering, right? As a form of architectural practice and what that would sort of mean in today's context, but also as a way of thinking about a future of architecture where, Vaijayanti was saying that the self-authorized architect sort of has dissolved in many ways, right? So what would it mean to think about architecture as where this, the author sort of almost disappears, but there's a sense of that it's a gathering of people, and what would then both research but also architecture practice sort of look like in that context?
Thanks, Prasad, for summarizing this panel. And I think, what you spoke about in terms of this kind of dissolving of the site, right? And that's really where modern practice was located, this idea of a bounded entity called the site, within which is private property in some ways, right? And that's where the client comes to you with this kind of thing, designed for me. But this idea of shifting from the site to a situated practice, right? The idea of also then thinking of situated knowledge. What does it mean to dissolve that? And I just want to just go back. I don't think that has been dissolved so far. It's this representation on this table is really a kind of sample of the dissolving, but out there in the world, I think there's a lot of work still to be done, because we still work with ideas of practices that are controlled. It's still that 5%, but the potential here is then to open up that practice. And I think also further dissolve it even more. So in that sense, I think, the students are here, and these are all the fifth year students who are also going to start practicing. What are the models of practice that they then build for themselves? Because of course, you also need to support yourself, So how do you build that? And I think this is where the key of starting to look at collaborations, where architects are not talking to architects, but they're talking to other kinds of people, other kinds of practitioners, where you're able to draw funds and resources from different places and not just the, kind of also break open that patron dependent nature of the profession. How do you become this kind of jockey almost, right? That you're able to put multiple things together. And I think probably the next panels are also going to bring some of that, because many of us, and that's where this gathering is important, many of the practitioners here have been able to dissolve that, and break open and start looking at what is then practice. And I think that's a model that students should be able to then, take ahead and build on. Because I think I'm also going to say that this is not the alternative, because we do not have a choice anymore. That 49% that we saw, those small 5% practices are in deep crisis. So it's not like it is a choice of being within or not, right? We have to in some ways embrace this the otherwise architecture really is an important thing to go to.
Coming at it from a different angle, I think what we are trying to do is perhaps blur the space of the academy a bit. Just the thing that you're in your tower and you look down on people and you study them and you write papers which no one really reads. So, you've got to be out there. You've got to be out there. You've got to build yourself in terms of build knowledge together, co-produce knowledge that's useful, that's situated, that's embedded in the knowledges of people. And you have therefore a responsibility to highlight some of that. What we don't do very well as, stilted perhaps academics who only write as a medium is, I think we have a lot more to learn from architectural practice or other practices, art, architecture, and I don't see us doing that very well. We are trying. It's taking us time. But I think what many of us faculty are doing now is experimenting with other kinds of media. So faculty have come up with the help of many interdisciplinary teams to produce a small documentary films. So there's one on the houseless community that I worked with. There's one by my colleague on the mangrove research that she's done with the coastal community, learning about how they look at the sea and the land and the fluidity of land actually, from the point of view of the community. We've also tried in our research on structural violence to come up with an online exhibition. It was supposed to be a physical exhibition, but COVID came and we moved it online. It's called Make Break, and it's about 4 sites that we looked at in Mumbai, 4 different neighborhoods, 4 very different geographies, but trying to map the kind of structural violences that occurred in these different communities, but through photographs, through doodles, through the work put in by a very, very good set of multidisciplinary teams, many of whom were architects coming out of their comfort zones to engage with us about the kind of language we were using, and we were trying to move into, a more kind of visual representation of what we saw. So I think this is still work in practice, and we welcome, anybody who's wanting to sort of get together and collaborate. And I think we've learned a lot from young architects who've come in and flowed in. There are several in our MWAD team, along with activists, along with very seasoned activists actually, who work, but we also have young architects working there. So yeah.
Unless someone else wants to, but I want to sort of, maybe I should have asked the different kind of a question, which is that if you're thinking about, research practice differently, academia differently, both into, and also the idea of architecture practice differently, which all of you already, have initiated that, right? But with a sense of, thinking about it as sort of with having some sense of a collective, right? There are certain tropes that are there, which is the question of justice, partial justice, from a different perspective. But what would you identify as these coordinates for this, new kind of architectural practice, right? If that is the possibility, but and I mean practice not in the sense of building, but like the kind of practices that you're engaged in. So what would be the coordinates for thinking about, architecture as a form of collecting and gathering and as a form of, extending academia, but also to think about, what is the architecture of this gathering, right? What would that look like, right? What are the coordinates for thinking about that?
Yeah, is it on? Yeah, I just want to follow up on that idea of like what is the architecture of this gathering, and I think some very important questions have been put on the table. One which concerns research itself. What is the nature of research, and how do we, whether it's like noticing things that, like the timber mills, that do not fall within a conventional concept of heritage, or it's about certain stakeholders who are invisible, or it's about also the practices that are, increasingly that 49% is going to sort of shade into, that are not conventional architectural offices. I think one across the board, one question is this notion of open-endedness, which is associated with research. And I feel like from speaking as a fellow social scientist, the idea of open-endedness in social sciences has actually lost the end, towards what end? And I think that is where the work of, very important work of TIS, foregrounding MWARD, its own kind of context and so forth, becomes incredibly relevant and generative, as you all were saying. And then on the architecture academia side, the very important idea of speculation as a practice that can only occur within the context of an architectural education, has, again, we have to think about what are the ends of that speculation. Is it simply to produce, the next great material that will replace, concrete, or is it, way more than that? Because we have now put together all of these different ends and created a gathering of what our ends are, ethically speaking, and then proceeding from there to craft, a kind of cohabitation between practices.
I kind of look at this in this particular way, where in the 60s and the 70s, when architecture education became formalized to some extent in India, the idea was to, in fact, generate a set of people who have certain type of skills, who can make buildings properly or even draw a building. But I think it's very fascinating to see the way we have shifted now to asking what exactly is architecture itself. And that coming out of these small set of schools across India, not all of them, but only very small set, that itself looks very encouraging, because the idea of the academy is not to produce, the workforce for the industry to make buildings the way we have made over and over again, but it is about engaging with cities, with people, with other non-human elements to think about what then is architecture. And I think that is something we need to really look at, and therefore the moment we ask that question, then one will have to blur that boundary, that silo of this is what is architecture, and then also speak to, say, an environmentalist or a sociologist or an ethnographer or an anthropologist. All of these starts opening up. So for the longest time, I feel we have looked at it in silos, inside these boxes, without speaking to each other. And now these practices, and that's where the idea of practice is sort of all-encompassing. It's not to make, but it is also to think. So I think that slowly the ecosystem is expanding. It's about give and take. It's about caring for each other. And I think that's what will then define how we look at architecture. So I think the definition of the word architecture and the profession itself is now sort of expanding, and that to me is very encouraging. I think that's a role of academy to sort of expand these limits at the moment.
One question for taking this further. What is the architecture of this practice? And I feel like there are a couple of coordinates of that. One is this really asking critical conceptual questions. And when you talk about media, I think it's not just a media that is able to represent something visually, but also be able to sort of become a lens to see, and ask new questions. Because if we still ask the old questions, then we would probably be perpetuating the structural violence, because oftentimes you see that, like you said, what is a home? A lot of times this idea of the home comes from providing a certain square meter house, and then you find that that house that is provided is actually much more violent than where people came from, right? So then what are the conceptual apparatuses that we are able to generate, a critical practice that we are able to generate for the new practitioners of a space of critical thinking? I think that's the first coordinate of this architecture. The second, I think, is the model of practice itself, this kind of breaking down of the Renaissance model of the architect, coming to this kind of hero modern architect who then has this one studio, this office that you aspire to. But I mean, again, this whole idea of living in a world today where you get Ubers, which are, there's a kind of aggregation model, co-working spaces. There's so many other models that are able to break this idea. And it's also no longer able, we are no longer able to afford that one model of this very expensive studio, as well. Because then you need to again perpetuate that. For that studio, you need to keep getting projects and building them in particular way. Have networks. You need to be a really rich person to be able to get networks of people who are able to then give you those projects. But again, that's where the architecture of the practice comes in, where you're able to create a more rhizomatic model, of sort of collaborations, networks, friendships and solidarities that are able to create much more, multiplicitous ways of engaging rather than this one singular path. So I think then, and that's, I think there's a lot of hope in the future generation, because they're already living these kind of networked lives They are autodidacts because their knowledge doesn't come from one source, it comes from multiple sources. And so I think that kind of the future of architecture, the architecture of practice lies in this multiplicity.
But while we say about this rhizomatic way of expanding the kind of practice, I also feel we shouldn't over romanticize this to some extent, because so for example, I am able to do all of whatever small works that I'm doing only because I have the support of the academy, which is funding me in some small little ways. And I've seen a lot of my friends, they are building what they are building because that's their way to sustain. So at one point, you also need to sustain, and at the same time, you also need to think. And I think where do we find that right balance is something probably the newer generation of architects might have as a challenge in front of them. And I think that's where the academy comes into the forefront, because if we can push those critical questions, they can start thinking while they are in the school itself, and see whether one wants to really make building and then subsidize that, use that to do something else, or whether they want to be in the academy raising these questions and use that to do a set of other forms of research. So I sometimes feel that while we say it needs to, break out of these silos, there's also a question of sustenance for the architects where we are traditionally in a particular method of practice.
Okay. Okay, we already over time, so 15 minutes over time, so I'll stop here, and I guess we'll continue the conversations in the next session. Yeah, sorry, I'll open it up to the audience and the other participants if they had, to contribute to the conversation.
Thank you, everybody. It was really enlightening because I come from a very problematic education system, the kind that you're talking about. And I feel really happy that, you guys have access to this sort of education. So my question really is to the audience, to the students who study here. What was your takeaway? What did you feel like you could aspire to any of this? Was it too overwhelming? I'm really curious to know what's running on your minds. So anybody, if you could share something.
Hello, hello. Yeah, so really lovely discussion, everyone. And answering your question, I feel eventually over the 5 years, we had a discussion the other day also, what is our idea of architecture and why do we come to architecture in the first place? I feel everyone's starting point is very different. Some come from a place of family background, some come from a place of genuine artistic interest, and some really are curious about how do you integrate art and something that generates money, because architecture is something that everyone kind of recommends you, that is a field where you can generate money and also do something with your arts. So that is where your aspiration for the field starts, and then you come to architecture. It is something about making buildings, but eventually over the course of 5 years what we've understood is it's more nuanced and multi-layered, as to we are not just designing buildings but we are making space. So what is then as a role of an architect to design space which caters to so many people and also can generate hierarchies and also dismantle it. So putting in the idea of social within these multidisciplinary fields of arts and architecture is something that I see myself going towards, and that is what a lot of discussion happens through. Then what is the questions of these spatial networks that we talk about? Who are we catering to? Are we really catering to the 1% population, or do we have a more bigger aspiration to have our architecture become more accessible to larger communities? Because in the end, that is what we as a society, because a lot of people, keep saying that architects design spaces and spaces design societies. So then that is kind of something where I see it happening, in even the larger discussions. Thank you.
Actually, the discussions which go around here uh, are really enlightening. But I liked it when it started going around the question of coordinates, because no matter how much we talk about these things, no matter how much we express how sensitive we are towards these issues, there is a coordination in reality that needs to be done. uh, it needs to be, I'm not using the word to be rationalized, but there needs to be some. So like the way Rupali said, yes, a financial model for your practice needs to be thought also in that way if you are going to practice in that way. Because I think financial models are something which I am very curious about your practices in particular, because so we have had many studios. I have worked with Swastik in Ahmedabad. When we actually went to build those modules, we went to fabricators. There's this different financial realm we are opened up to. The academia needs to engage to this other world also simultaneously. And I've also attended discussion where uh, many bigger renowned practices are expecting industry ready architects. So for us, after gaining this education, it's really a choice, and it's a good platform over here to start a negotiation, or a way for us to think through if we are going to have a practice of our own in the future. How do you go about it? Because maybe you will work for 4 or 5 years in a so-called firm which is paying you well, but then you save enough money to start a firm which works according to your principles, but it will not work initially. There'll be these things which we also start wondering about when we listen to these discussions. So that is something which started in all our heads.
And I think one more question for me was to also look at other types of practices, because most often when it comes to the financial model, like even here 2 points were like, is it necessary that I have to build a second home of a C-suite person to do more installation that I like? So personally, I try to look at, like, basically architecture is mostly space planning, but it never says that it has to be physical. So currently what I'm trying to do is design environments and spaces for video games. And that is something which is helping me to do physical installations and the kind of work that I want to do. Also, like, I'm trying to find other medias or practices where I can engage, like as a trained architect, which would help me sort of do more work. Because after a point, like one of the offices where I was interning, they did these second homes. It's very boring.
I have a question, if possible.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. My question is a little bit to everyone, but what is the collaboration that these various practices have with the public sector, and is the public sector a space where the student can the space can the student can engage with, and to understand really all the mechanism that, you know, urban policies, urban mechanism, and to have a to sort of infiltrate that space. Is there a possibility to infiltrate the space for student to a little bit? Because I think what I find very interesting that we're speaking at various scales, and various practices work at various scales. So so at the end, I think the what is interesting is to also to try to understand towards what end, it was told, like toward what end we're doing that. Is if it's to really have an impact, is it not very important to have this relation with the public sector, as deficient as it can be, as possibly, you know, I don't want to say corrupt, but possibly also corrupt, but still can we avoid that collaboration? And can can't is it not important to have them, you know, also in this space of exchange and around the urban, and around what architecture is, and around spatial justice? I mean, even if they're not really too open to it, but it's not important to have some at least some people that are allies from this sector, like. It's not to anyone specific, that question.
I mean, Ratula, can I just quickly say that I think the first generation of professionally trained architects in India, at least, were public works department architects. They were hired by the state, by the government. That was the biggest client, as it were, right? And the world that students are finding themselves in is a privatized world, and where you have to really pay attention to, you know, getting clients, as you said. And I mean, I think this should have been a separate panel altogether, this question of livelihoods, because it's not only the architect's livelihood, but it's also the you know, people that they're working for. Do they have livelihoods, you know?
I think it's critical to, of course, partner, collaborate with the public sector, and I don't think the MWard library would have actually happened unless we had collaborated with the Municipal Corporation of Mumbai, particularly the Assistant Commissioner, Municipal Commissioner, who was there at that time. He was persuaded not just through visuals, but, you know, through several ways in which the community came up with, you know, this real need to reclaim that space. So yes, I think it's very important, and at various scales we try and do it in our work with, you know, whether it's writing a white paper or organizing smaller meetings, but we try and always involve sections of the public sector to come in, to respond to what we have to say, what the community has to say, to embed the community. So, and we try and build that relation also over time. So the Assistant Municipal Commissioner, who is part of the project, is now, you know, tries and be a benefactor over time in MWard. You know, various projects are taken forward. So whether it is water connections for the poor, whether it is, you know, sanitation projects, whether you need to move a file across, you know you have a friend in there. But increasingly, of course, what we find is that the urban sector is unfortunately dominated by consultants, particularly management consultants. So a lot of the work is outsourced to people who have no perhaps architectural background, may not even have a policy, social science background, but come from perhaps an engineering you know, management background, which is a strange set of skills. So, you know, you're really dealing with these consultants who have very little embeddedness in communities, either in the way that you have engaged with communities, or our students are engaging with communities. So that's what we are up against, is a whole domination of consultants in what we think is the public sector.
Just a very quick response to the public sector question, because I worked with the public sector for 10 years more actually, and it's I think there is an overestimation of its abilities and capacities and abilities, because public sector is very good with projects, with quickly doing projects and tendering and this kind of things. It's good with some programs like vaccination, like family planning, it can do certain things. When it comes to, for example, the question of housing, for 50 years we've been struggling, and even in 2014 the housing shortage was estimated to be 19 million or something like that. So public sector is not good at that, And in the last 20 years, you see that in the most generous of policy and the most generous of program and the most generous of finances, you find that only less than 10% of this 19 million actually being built, even if it was about building houses. So public sector is really not good at it. So, and our own studies kind of say that public sector is one of the actors, not the actor, and in some cases it becomes detrimental. We know the case of Dharavi at the moment, because I want to bring this, because it's how one shapes, pulls, works with around public sector. So, and the reliance on the techno-legal language. Public sector requires techno-legal language for it to kind of move, produce, shape, etc., which is not the language of the city usually. We speak through poems, we speak through, proverbs, we speak through narrative stories, so many things. So I think in that situation, in our work, we've kind of decided to stand outside, and see how direct support to communities can kind of, work. I'm saying communities very, very loosely, understanding all the complexities in that. But working directly, because working with figuring out ways in which encroachments can be made, working in the ways which, things can happen without explicit approvals, because they take time and then they are extensively expensive sometimes. So there are ways in which people have been doing things and working, and that is how that 90% works. We've not, the problem has been that the architects is trying to figure out ways in which the public sector would enter from from its policy program and projects into that 90%. It doesn't work. So that's the problem actually. So that's why I think the public sector, it's an interesting kind of a thing. And public sector today works with consultants, as you said. They're like, I worked with the planning authority for 10 years, and the jobs are done by consultants who are kind of not accountable, and then. So it's the public sector. One has to see it very carefully as to what is and I think that's the point. One can make what these collaborations can do, going beyond the public sector.
Thanks for this wonderful conversation. I just want to ask a question, a companion question to the architecture of gathering. The question that I want to ask, because due to the conversations that unfolded, is along with the architecture of gathering, what is the form of gathering, in the sense that I want, if Rupali, Somini, and Ratula, but I also want to draw Sahil and Fabia as well as Vaijanti into the question. In the sense that there are 5 institutions or 4 institutions, how can they arrive in a conversation, and what form will could that conversation take in the triennial? That's one. And the second one is what happened. What was very interesting was the prefacing about who's an architect and not an architect, and expansion of the form of knowledge that the spatial practice embeds. So there, a companion question is to ask what forms of texts are being written by architects, and then what forms of visuals are being created by practices which have been textual. If one can ask opposite questions, what kinds of movements are we seeing? Do they tend towards the older Foucauldian question of interrogating the disciplinarity of disciplines, or is there something new that is taking place over here?
Oh, you do? We are, but very quickly, yeah. I've been doing it for a while, but yeah.
Okay, like 2 seconds. Sorry, we are all like multi-institutions that I'm just taking over. No, but I'm very excited by that question actually, because, it just came recently to mind that the social sciences, as we know them, and in the sort of modern university form, it really began at the beginning of the 20th century. And they had the city as a kind of hidden underlayer. They were all really inspired, or in some sense they were confronting problems of urban life that was emerging at that point. And then at the end of the 20th century, we have a whole new discipline called urban studies, which is, kind of like I don't know what it is. I mean, all of us belong in it. And I love the way Rupali said that we're all spatial practitioners. So I think the point is like to find those types of conceptual hooks that can bring us all together in some conversation. I have no answer to how institutions can come together, because frankly I'm a free agent. No, but I think that's a very important part of it, right? Sometimes there are no conversations because institutionalization is so sclerotic that it doesn't allow for that flow to happen. It comes through solidarity and friendships. That's...
Okay. So we'll end this session here. Thank you so much, Somni, Ratula, and Rupali, and everyone for this lively conversation.